Final speaker before, and I'll just say to you, we have cream teas in about 45 to 50 minutes. And so Mark now has sort of 25 minutes, and he said he probably couldn't do it in under 30, but I'm going to ask him to.
Going to try.
He's going to try. He's going to.
Before philosophy talk, I don't want to stand up if you want.
Yeah.
Shake around a bit just to get some oxygen to the brain.
Yeah. Yeah. There we go. Set the tone. Mark, Juhan Schunemann, thank you very much.
Thank you. This side, yeah. Is there something that I can wire up with? Can I use a wire up? Yeah, keep shaking around and integrating all this ingenious philosophy. I hope we can all not fall asleep during the fourth philosophy talk of the day.
And last.
Fourth and last, thank God. Goddess. Thank you. Thank you so much, Joseph, for being so great with I'd be so much more stressed if it weren't for you. And I know you probably find it easy, but it's a lovely symbiotic relationship. Round of applause for Joseph. Okay, so I'm going to talk about instituent or instituted experiences, and I'm going to try and understand what we've heard so far in the form of centripetal and centrifugal integration. And these are words you haven't heard before, probably, and we're going to unpack them. So I'd just like to start with acknowledging the difficulties inherent in bringing Amazonian experience back into the Western metropolis, where people often find themselves relegating their experiences to the cognitive realm of the fairy tale. This paper reckons with the autochthonous styles of integration by another name found in our own society. These various rituals of preparation, intake, integration, structure experience, and conduit values, motives, and actions. And so I'm asking here whether integration requires a language even, or if it can be understood centrifugally and centripetally, that is, moving inwards and outwards from the self. But to understand what I mean, I'd like to quote a few of the talks so far. So Jeff spoke of Maslow's psychopathology of the average, which something a dear friend of mine who can no longer join us for personal reasons, Danny Nemu, referred to as BDSD, or boring dullness hypertolerance disorder. You may also, Jeff, you also used a curious phrase. I'm excited to see what psychedelics do to the medical model. I can't see you, Jeff, but that was a really interesting phrase. Paul, you spoke about how destabilizing it can be to have these new found well springs of energy. And Ros, you spoke about outegration. Christine reminded us that the questionnaire infrastructure flattens experience to linear measures when actually we can choose a framework for our curve to avoid this radical change without radical change. And Andy, you reminded us that it's the focus on the self that causes the need for the discourse on integration. Peter, finally, thank you for reminding us that the coming psychedelic infrastructure that we hope for is not just institutional, it's also metaphysical. So all these calls come some way to describing what I mean by centrifugal integration. I'm going to start with looking at ways in which integration can be problematized using an empirical sociology paper and contextualizing that in terms of Betty Eisner's matrix. After this, I'm going to look at interim findings from a social study that we're conducting here at Exeter of integration practitioners and the manifold ethnographies of the rave movement. And I'll conclude with a kind of personal revelation that I had last year on 5-MeO-DMT about this question. And I guess the question I kind of want to answer at the end is it true what Mark Aishala says in his book that 1 hour of preparation is worth 10 hours of integration? When is this true? When is this not true? And hopefully this theory of centripetal, centrifugal integration will help. But let's begin with Andrew Christopher Dean. So he published a paper in a travel and tourism journal detailing the experience of many ayahuasca tourists. His finding, put simply, is that when the individuals whom he interviewed returned home, their experiences had to be relegated to the fairy tale. Rife with animistic assumptions, otherworldly beings, they made no sense anymore to their friends, their family, their colleagues. It made no sense to their largely secularized milieu. There was nothing and no one back home receptive to their experience, and the fact that it is relegated for these people to the fairy tale category also unduly idealizes their experience on a political level. As our colleague here, Evgenia Fuciu, notes, the romanticization, I quote from her paper, of indigenous peoples is not benign. It's a one-sided romantic image that hides the complexity of indigenous people's situations by erasing the injustices that they have experienced and continue to. So she proposes a more holistic approach to ayahuasca shamanism that views indigenous peoples not living in fictitious harmony, but people embedded in larger struggles, just like we are. Back to Andrew Christopher Dean's paper, the unique offering of the marketplace of tourism was that then of the consumable fairy tale, which functions in satisfying the touristic desires for magic, transformation, and enchantment. The problem he diagnoses in an ethic conclusion, which is amicably assented to by his participants, by interlocutors, is that while an ethereal curtain had descended on the tourists within hours of their first ayahuasca ceremony, this magical veil was quickly lifted by returning to the mundane West. Dean continues, when we consider that all the participants in this study rejected further tourism, it seemed that collisions of sense between indigenous and Western systems are at some level unavoidable, and raises the question of how might tourists who develop devout supernatural beliefs cope in the West? From the author's experience, it seems unlikely that they will, unless this issue is addressed more fundamentally within the shamanic communities who can aid their tourists in developing resilience to the challenge of returning home. But why is it on them? Why can't it be on us? And I'm noticing also an interesting distinction between the indigenous animistic worldview and the metropolitan worldview. As children in cities, we're encouraged to explain away the night terrors under the bed. This is in notable contrast to a lot of the ethnographic record. In Falling Sky, the book on the left, Davy Kopenawa explores what he calls the Xapiri's gaze. So this is the view of the spirits, because as a shaman, you can actually see the world from the perspective of the spirits. He says, as children, we gradually start to think straight. We realize that the Xapiri really exist and that the elders' words are true. In the West, we think straight by maturing and realizing the unreality of spirits. In this culture, thinking straight is realizing that the beings encountered in our dreams are actual. Thinking straight means considering the facticity of spirits. This is in notable contrast to the metropolitan, scientifically literate elite who often attend these ceremonies. Suddenly, the monsters under the bed are real. Another example in the ethnographic record is found in the biography of Pablo Amaringo in his and Luis Eduardo Nunes collection of art and ekphrases of ayahuasca visions. In this story, the child Amaringo has been bequeathed a group of guardian spirits by his father during an ayahuasca journey at the age of 10. He claims at the time, perhaps this is so, but I did not really believe this. Subsequently, though, in an ayahuasca journey later in life, he neglects to mention the fact that he had bequeathed these spirits at the age of 10 because he didn't believe in them to an older mestizo practitioner. And at this point, the mestizo practitioner actually sees that the spirits that belonged to me came. The old man became silent as if mute. He said, listen, young man, what are you doing with me? You've taken ayahuasca before. You could have me killed. The spirits then that my father gave me were looking at the old man, and that is why he was angry with me. So there's this triangulation, right? Here again, we have the realization that the spirits are in some way real, and that's the revelation that distinguishes the child who does not take their reality seriously to the adult who does. So in these two indigenous examples above, dreams about spirits are assumed to be not true and then revealed by cultural interaction to actually be true. But in our cities, as I say again, the night terrors are often assumed by children to be true and then coped with by adults by relegating them to the realm of the untrue, the fairy tale. So what worldviews do we have then to fall back on? What comforting routines and rituals? What spaces? what stories? This wider milieu which surrounds the experiencer in the context of psychedelic experience can be understood in terms of Betty Eisner's matrix, a concept originally conceived to articulate the environment to which the participant returns and the environment which they've come from. A good matrix, writes Eisner, is a place where the best interests of the separate individuals are served within the creative context of the larger relationship. In Eisner's conception of the matrix, this conception arose to accommodate for the existence of a therapeutic community. But because the matrix refers to the broader term environment, it seems also to include metaphysical systems, questions of religious narratives, the notion that unanswerable questions about spirituality are a private affair, as they are in our culture, or that, as in many medicine work cultures, the all-nurturing Pachamama needs nurturing, or infrastructural givens, such as community centers, church halls, confession booths, acupuncture rooms, shopping malls. This all makes up the matrix. And this concept is intended to give an account for how the wider setting, beyond the specific setting, that is the place where the altered state is occurring with feng shui in the room, the feng shui considered, clinical beeps, playlists, or Icaros, paintings on the walls, the crucifix in the corner. That's the setting. But the matrix is this wider milieu, and that impacts the experience. So the question I ask in this paper is, when is it that, echoing Jeff's question earlier, the altered states impact the matrix? Thus, we begin to get a sense of centrifugal integration. Rather than a synchronic model, which Jeff and Mark Aishala offer, this tries to capture what's going on diachronically through time. And a demand is there to come down into a world which it is worth inhabiting, the kind of world which is receptive to the experience. That is, in the case of ayahuasca tourism, a metaphysical and infrastructural accounting for animistic experience, for the personality and the interiority of the beyond human natural world. And it is to how this world is becoming more receptive that I now turn. And for resources in answering the question of how the matrix helps or doesn't help to integrate experience, and how the matrix itself is changed by experiences, I will look at three things. Firstly, an interim analysis being conducted here at Exeter with Christine and Celia of integration providers. Secondly, theorizations of the rave movement and the extent to which it's political or not, and that debate. And my own 5-MeO DMT experience. So this is the next section, centripetal, centrifugal, just to remind you. So these are the themes that came up so far in the interviews I've conducted. Integration isn't always communicable, it's also embodied. That's the first thing to think about. Providing an integration service puts the provider in a position of power, and preparation aids integration if it involves clear intention. But it can be obstructive if it involves inflated expectation, such as cliches touted by the media from the matrix. Emphasis should be on the agency that people have over their choices and their narrativization, rather than on emphasizing their powerlessness, which must also be taken into account. The point I want to make here off the back of this is that, given the links between responsibility and power, the cognitive liberty of integration is not simply a freedom to or freedom from, but a freedom for others. The freedom for co-creating, the kind of world worth integrating into. With psychedelic rituality in particular, one important theory proves informative in explaining the role that tradition has, both passively upon us, but also actively in its invention. In the closing statements of Chris Partridge's High Culture, he looks at this famous moment of Gordon Wasson and Maria Sabina as a cultural microcosm. So when Wasson discovered, or actually it was his wife who discovered Sabina, who'd been using it for thousands of years, but so maybe discovered isn't the right word. But anyway, In their meeting in Mexico with this Mazatec mushroom shaman, Maria Sabina, his motivation and method of ingestion fundamentally differed from hers. Sabina had used it primarily for healing others to aid the community, whereas Wasson had used it first for me and my experience as a tool for transcendence. So the former, for divination and healing, is understood centrifugally. So the focus of the sacred labor is directed outwards towards others in the community. This requires singing songs for others, as in Christine's first slide, co-creating a culture for the community to cultivate. This is contrasted to centripetally, where the focus of sacred labor is directed inwards towards the self. Quoting Partridge there. So the focus on the experiencing self is associated with a detraditionalizing act. Detraditionalization is a free-floating, quoting again, is an experience characterized by a free-floating detachment from original interpretative frameworks, reinterpreted then according to a range of other subjectively determined or cultural memes. But I take retraditionalization to be its dialectical motion. When traditions are gradually invented, handed down, that's where tradition comes from, tradere, to hand down, and even changed, but seen as so that we are seen as in league with our ancestors, with our antecedents, rather than purely a question of individual experience and interpretation. So any drug experience can contain movements in both directions, but the question here is about the net movement of sacred labor. Now to the rave scene. Oh yes, and I love this. So this, I meant to put this at the beginning, sorry. This is Bachet's definition for integration, which I love. And it's synchronic, whereas this centripetal, centrifugal idea that I have is diachronic, right? So it's the movement from the internal to the external and back. So François Gautier, in his ethnography of rave, uses the notion of the instituent versus the instituted to understand rave's religio-political dimension. The distinction is akin to one which looks at religion as a fundament of culture versus a religion of a particular type. So instituted forms of religiosity are generally moralistic, sentimental annexes of bourgeois class rule, which offer a mythical foreground aimed at order and structure, right? Whereas instituent forms offer a transgressive sacrality which dissolves previous forms, offering a renewal via disorder and reorganization. And while these are dialectically related, instituted forms require a certain instituency to avoid degradation. Instituent forms also require a domestication to allow an integrated passage from the sacred to the profane. Capoeira, as well as rave, is both a martial art and a dance form, and it functions to channel the dangerous but necessary instituent experience of the sacred. And Western metropolitan cultures are postmodern locations, one could argue, with no consistent claim to truth, so meaning must come from the experience itself. But Bastide argues that the solution to the problems of a transitional society are actually found beyond ideas, such as myths or representations, and instead in this immanence of sociality, affect, and social heat. So, where this could serve to explain the social dimension of rave's function, the question of why individuals gravitate towards the method of rave can be drawn from Bataille's notion of the damned or accursed share. So this is symbolized by the inextinguishable hubris of the Promethean vulture who constantly comes back to feast. From the seemingly infinite feast, there is no limit to his livering desire. Bataille argues that Weber's emphasis on science, progress, and reason neglects the uneconomic, gratuitous, and excessive facets of human life. What about unusefulness? Waste, luxury, mourning, games, aesthetics, war, debauchery, drunkenness, sacrificial, erotic consumption, that which cannot be accounted for and must be spent, as lovers are, outside any productive end. So modernity's attempt, according to Gautier, via Bataille, was to sacralize work itself in a negation of the accursed share by sublimating it into the consumer economy. Rave is a form of festivity, then, which differs fundamentally from any other form of ritual because of its degree of play and spontaneity. More to the point, it is an outliving of this accursed share, disengaged from a telos. The celebration is not a reenactment of an original myth, but a reposting of meaning outside itself, its aim being to escape time, to elude memory, and an effervescence sought for itself in itself. How much time do I have? Oh dear, that's frightening. Sure, yeah, that's probably true. So I'm gonna, okay. Having said that, recent conceptions of rave culture, such as Norman Doyle's Threshold, argue that people come back from places like the Berghain empowered and awake. So, in the knowledge that I have 4 minutes left, I'm gonna leave to the community and to the discussion the extent to which rave is or isn't political on the face of those theories. But I'd just like to say a little bit about my 5MEO experience before we finish. So aside from dissolving into everything and experiencing the total life review and all that kind of stuff, the message I got was quite simple. The amount of good work one does in the physical world of objects and things and people, the easier the work, the spiritual work becomes. Whereas if the world is ignored, the more work there is to do than in the spiritual world. And conversely, the more spiritual work one does, the easier quotidian life becomes, the more flow states you have just existing in the everyday. So in conclusion, see, we missed this, but it's fine. It's like Peter. In conclusion, integration can clearly be centripetal, the induction of structures and values from the surrounding culture, or centrifugal, the introduction of new values, new structures, and the transduction of values across cultural liminal zones. So Partridge and myself are not alone in this introduction of the centrifugal to the debate. On page 11 of High Culture, Eric Davis, that amazing deviant scholar of religion, refers to the centrifugal turn away from the naturalistic or probabilistic or historical norm. In spite of naturally, he refers, in spite of naturally remaining intimately tied with them by its definition over and against them. And so Davis, I would like to integrate, to use the old buzzword, into this paper in terms of his conception of the self. One of the main ways I enjoy integrating is to write a poem. And in the Native American Church, which is another group I look at, it involves a ritualized dehydration. So everyone is withheld water until a particular moment in the ceremony called the midnight water, the men's water, the water from the sky, and then the women's water in the morning, the water from the ground. And in that process, everyone hydrates together and the water becomes a medicine. So I integrated that experience by writing a poem. This is one of the ways I like to personally integrate. So I'd like to share with you this poem and then an Eric Davis quote, and then I'm done. Is that all right? Yeah, I think it's fine. Cool. Water. So I don't know how to pronounce it, the title, but I'll just read it to you. Water trickles as tricks of memory through lips and lids, bits of its own. Water flows through love wounds, winds through trove woods, binds us to words we may say. Water flickers through rays quicker than color, then lays its body flat behind vanishing surfaces, banishing services, ravishing turquoise, quartz, crystal. What a lot of water was used to make the thunder, was fused to make the human, who dreams of once and one day being absorbed in hunting common auroch for rare steak, bacterial being, Michael's mitochondria, giant, warm-blooded dragons that were. From the worst first thirst of morning to the last rasping draft in desert, your earliest swirls and latest arrivals bring hope to the swirliest earls and girls their justice deserts. Turn the tap, no more. Water war, warm water, worn water, in witness to all moments. All dripping trips and skinny dips, all omens and memories you absorb and clean until there's nothing left but you. Facts are not like frogs, are not like your childhood Raggedy Ann, and as historically constituted personalities, we may indeed reside in the prison house of language, but all manner of sunbeams and birdsong and gut hunches leak through the barred windows of our talk. These phenomena not only touch us, but perturb our language as well, even as those languages possess us at least as much as we possess them. The world is full of constructions, but it is full of encounters too, and the vibrant margins wherein we meet these others shape and sometimes shatter those languages, concepts, and identities that, equally inevitably, map and manufacture the frameworks within which we make do. Thank you.